In the 1993 classic Jurassic Park, Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by the great Jeff Goldblum, explained to his co-star Laura Dern the principles of the butterfly effect. Now, simply put, this is the theory of how a seemingly small action in one space can lead to huge outcomes in another. Well, my guest today is the embodiment of that butterfly effect. From college radio show host to record label executive, from movie music supervisor to NYU professor, his actions helped to shape a couple of generations of pop culture, and it all started with an essay. Bill Stephney, thank you so much for being my guest on All Things Men.
Thank you very much, Mark. It is indeed a pleasure and a privilege.
Bill, your bio has worn me out. There's so much on there. What made you get into the business in the first place?
Well, Mark, first and foremost, I probably have to cite the fact that I grew up being a radio nerd, that I'm part of, I think, a generation that grew up with the transistor radio as our best friend, that the coolest music of the late 60s, 70s, 80s, going into the early 90s, you could find first on that transistor radio before that transformed to the boombox for my colleagues of the hip hop generation. But I lost myself in the world of radio and music, very early on, and that catapulted me into diving deeper into radio, to the point where I followed great careers like Frankie Crocker and Mark McEwen.
Thank you. Frankie Crocker. Tell me about that scholarship you got from WLIR.
In my senior year of high school, as I'm trying to figure out what college I'm going to attend, WLIR, which was a popular rock and roll radio station on Long Island, partnered with the Long Island Urban League, the civil rights organization, and the National Urban League, and a university, Adelphi University on Long Island, to offer a full scholarship to study media and communications to a student, an African-American student, in the New York City tri-state area, who could express through essay form, and this is now, 40 years ago. So it shows you that, we've come a long way to get nowhere. 40 years ago, they wanted a student to express the importance of having diversity in media. So as I always tell it, clearly they only received one essay because I won the contest and won the scholarship.
I disagree with that because I know you're very, very good. How did you meet Chucky D from Public Enemy?
I was already the music director, becoming the program director of our campus radio station, WBAU 90.3 FM at that point. And I really programmed my own radio show on Monday nights to become, in essence, Long Island's and one of the few hip hop radio shows for that period. So it's 1982. We drew a following. There was a DJ, a mobile DJ collective called Spectrum City, that was run by a young man named Hank Shockley from Roosevelt, Long Island, the same town on Long Island that has produced Public Enemy, Julius Irving, Eddie Murphy and Charlie Murphy, and Howard Stern. So Spectrum City, wherever they had parties on Long Island, I tried to show up, even if I was too young. So one day on the Adelphi campus, I see this guy with a silk Spectrum City crew jacket. And I'm like, how could anybody from one of the coolest collectives and groups that I know of, how could someone so cool be on a campus so uncool as Adelphi University? And so I approach him and I introduce myself. Hey, I'm Bill Stephney. I go by the name Mr. Bill on WBAU, and he said, yeah, hey man, I'm a fan. My name is Chuck. And I'm also a graphic arts major here at Adelphi. So he was a fellow student who was also part of the coolest DJ crew.
Bill, is it true that Chuck didn't really want to be a rapper, that you had to talk him into being part of Def Jam?
Yes, Mark. Again, we loved radio so much and had such a great time. When we started our college radio show, and just to give a little bit of flavor, um, this is the early '80s, and still, I again reference, Frankie Crocker being so dominant as an influencer. He was the program director and chief radio personality on WBLS, which was the top rated FM radio station in New York City at that point. And by default, that made it the top rated music radio station in the country. So, we all wanted to be Frankie Crocker. We looked for that point, and where we didn't get to be Frankie Crocker, we said, maybe we can be Mark McEwen. So, either one of those destinations seemed to be more real and apparent. Hip hop is just developing, and even black stardom, as it's become today, wasn't what it was in 1982. Look, Chuck D grew up with Eddie Murphy in Roosevelt. That was all crew. They're all the same age, and they lived within blocks. Even Eddie wasn't a big star yet. Our big stars were the guys on the radio. So radio was really the target for our careers. So even when there were opportunities offered at radio stations, I pursued the opportunity to work for much less money for Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons as they were launching Def Jam Records. And one of my obligations and directives from Rick Rubin was to sign my friend Chucky D. Rick thought he had a great rap voice and would be incredible, and that it would be my mission to bring him as a part of the Def Jam roster.
Bill, let me jump ahead just a bit and run some names by you. Public Enemy, The Bomb Squad, Dr. Dre, the East Coast Dr. Dre, and Yo MTV Raps, Busta Rhymes, etc. Your college radio station, WBAU, seems to be the launch point for so many historical things that happened during the golden age of rap. How did that all begin?
It's hard to say. I would say this, that Nassau County, where we all grew up, where Public Enemy comes from, where Busta Rhymes comes from, it's only 15 minutes via the Parkway to the border of New York City. So, even though our addresses formally say that we're growing up on Long Island, we're still basically New York City area influenced. So as hip hop develops through the 70s, from the Bronx and Harlem and Brooklyn through Queens to Long Island, this is pretty much happening all instantaneously. Even for somebody like me, though my mother and father moved from Harlem in the Bronx to Long Island when I was fairly young. We're also from that generation, and I'm from that generation where our mothers and fathers were close to their extended families, and my extended family was in the Bronx, and that influence for me, for Chuck, whose family also migrated from the city to Long Island. Many of the African American families in Nassau County and Suffolk County on Long Island established their own great migration from New York City, from Harlem, Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, to go out to bring backyards and driveways to their kids. And I was one of those beneficiaries. I think that gave us, an advantage of consuming the culture that our cousins in the projects had, but we had the facility of basements and backyards and some extra resources in order to perhaps refine, our approach to the culture.
Cool. We recently lost another icon, Paul Mooney. You worked with Paul Mooney. Two things. Do you remember when you first met? And how did you two work together?
Yeah, my wife Tanya, who's worked in the music business, who had worked in the music business and worked with me at our label Stepson Music, had been a huge Paul Mooney fan. And she implored me as I was launching, and we were launching Steps on Music, to reach out to Paul. So as I was working on Boomerang, actually, I was living half the year in Los Angeles in the Mondrian Hotel on Sunset. The Mondrian Hotel sat directly across from a place called the Comedy Store, which was the go-to live comedy destination in Hollywood, in Los Angeles. And almost every night, Paul Mooney closed the club. He held court. There's a joke about Paul in that when comedians close, in order to get them off of the stage, the comedy club would have a red light
Right.
that they would turn on to notify the comedian. All right, 5 minutes, buddy. So the legend always with Paul is that Paul never saw the red light. That he would continue right through, and the red light. Let's say if he started his routine at 10 p.m., the red light would still be on at 3 a.m. with Paul continuing to do his thing. So I one night walked in 1991, walked across the street to the Comedy Store, checked him out, just laughed. Came the next night, he was there, checked him out, laughed even harder, and kept on till I really got the nerve, and we got the information to call him and let him know that I was coming by and I wanted to speak to him after one of his routines, which I did. And we struck a bond from that moment and worked together for 10 years to record 3 albums, 2 that we did release, and one, especially Race, being one of the most critically acclaimed comedy albums of all time. But Paul, his brain, there are certain folks on the planet, their brains just process culture and life so differently. He definitely was one of those. Pryor, Dave Chappelle, the great Chris Rock. There are folks that their lens is just so different. And I had the absolute pleasure and privilege to watch him and at his height, by the way, 30 years ago.
Bill, you mentioned Chris Rock. You worked with him a project called The Illtop. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so there was a point when Chris was on Saturday Night Live when he became somewhat frustrated that the writing staff, many of whom had honed their skills for comic writing early on as students at Harvard University for the Harvard Lampoon. That they were all white, they were all Ivy League, and they could not write for his voice and who he is. So he came up with the brilliant idea that if Harvard had the Harvard Lampoon that produced all of these comedians, well, why not go to Howard, the Harvard of historically black colleges and universities, and launch a comedy magazine venture there with the students. Chris asked me to help him with it because, as he said at the time, that I was his only friend who owned a pencil. So that made me uniquely qualified to help run his venture.
Where does Donald Glover fit into this whole scene?
So the program that Chris Rock and I launched at Howard University, at a certain point, we thought that it really warranted expansion. So we approached a good friend by the name of Doug Herzog. Doug had been the head of programming for MTV during like the great days of the late 80s and early 90s, and then went over to run Fox Television, USA Networks. He had come back to run Comedy Central. So I called him and said, "Hey, Chris and I have been doing this project at Howard. What if we partnered with Comedy Central to identify, more young people of color who might be interested in a career in comedy?" And by the way, this is at the same time that the Chappelle Show is killing on Comedy Central. So in essence, we were trying to find more Chris Rocks and more Dave Chappelle's. So we set up that program to find 6 students every summer, and we call the project Summer School. And they would come to New York City, live in the city if they didn't already, and they would work at Comedy Central for the summer, working through all the various departments at the network, and also working on some of the key shows like The Daily Show, and at that point, The Colbert Report. So Jon Stewart was part of our program. Stephen Colbert was part of our program. We'd have wonderful guests who would come in to talk and teach comedy, like Whoopi Goldberg, Conan O'Brien, Carlos Mencia, Susie Essman. It was fantastic. And one of the students who shined from that program was this young NYU student who had all the energy in the world, had all sorts of ambition and vision. And his name was Donald, and is Donald Glover, Childish Gambino.
I spoke earlier to a guy from the United Negro College Fund about the value of scholarships. If you hadn't gotten that scholarship to WLIR, how do you think not only would your life have turned out different, but how would the world have turned out different?
I know my life would have been different. Whether or not, there are some days when I'm like, with hip hop, oh, well, yeah, we've done some good, and some other days, so, I don't know about the world, but in terms of my life directly, I can't calculate the value of the support of the Urban League, which I later became a member of its board, of WLIR of Adelphine University from that period. And over the years now, we fast forward, this past spring semester 2021, I became a professor at New York University at NYU for the Clive Davis Institute, teaching music business. So, my life in that respect has come full circle, based on the importance of the support of that scholarship, and understanding the importance early on of academics.
Bill, just so you know, I was a radio nerd myself.
Of course you were.
And
Of course.
it, it turned out okay. Bill,
No,
thank you so much.
turned out incredibly.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for that again, Mark. Thank you for your pioneering. Not many folks know that there was a period, especially in the late 70s, early 80s, for radio and for rock and roll radio, where it was non-diverse, to be quite polite about it. And there are very few folks who someone like me could look up to as someone who did it and did it on such a high level. I know everyone remembers you for TV and what you're doing today, and that's fantastic. But man, Mark McEwen on the radio. There are a generation of us who can cite your success as an influencer for our own success.
Thank you, Bill. You're going to make me cry. Thank you so much. All the best to you, my friend.
To you as well, my friend. Thank you so much.
Paul Mooney was a comedic genius and sadly one that we recently lost. Beginning his career telling jokes as a ringmaster with the circus, he eventually became a writer for my friend, the late great Richard Pryor. Initially, Mooney was the head writer for In Living Color, inspiring the unforgettable Homie the Clown. You may also remember him as the great Negrodamus on the Dave Chappelle Show. Paul Mooney died of a heart attack at his home in Oakland, California on May 19, 2021. He was 79 years old. Thank you for tuning in to All Things Men. We'll see you next time.